Wally comes to us today as beautiful as she was on the day that Egon Schiele captured her in brushstrokes and color nearly a century ago. She has experienced so much and has so much to tell.
We heard about the allegations of the ownership of the Schiele paintings, and it was the 11th hour, and they were about to return to Austria, and we kind of threw a Hail Mary pass. We issued a grand jury subpoena, hoping that we could develop the evidence to support that case. But if we hadn't issued it, painting would have gone back, and we would never have had a chance to ascertain the true ownership.
We wouldn't be sitting here talking about art restitution in 2010 the way we do if we wouldn't have had Wally. And I can't think of any other case that you know, had this effect, had this significance. I think it is the case out of all art restitution cases that I can think of that really shaped the discussion for the following years.
These are vestiges of a people's history, of a family's history. And it is terribly important, I think, that be honored. There should be a rush to judgment on these cases.
On behalf of the Museum of Modern Art, it is my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to this wonderful celebration for the opening of Egon Schiele, the Leopold Collection, Vienna.
There's an immediacy to Schiele. I mean, that's what's exciting about the artist. You know, you look at a Schiele today and you don't feel that he's talking from another generation.
Schiele was sort of a star. And these young kids would follow him around the way they would follow around an appealing creative character.
Well, what's ironic about Klimt and Schiele and their incorporation into the Austrian cultural canon is that back in their day, they were considered pornographers and outsiders of society.
He has this reputation in today's world because the salaciousness of it makes it exciting for the media. Television shows, movies, auction houses, dealers, they love to play on this. It excites the imagination of the person viewing. I think he was a pretty normal 20-year-old guy who had an eye for pretty girls, and they were freely available, and he had his way.
I don't think there is any modern master whose prices have increased as exponentially as did Schiele's between 1941, when we had the first Schiele show at the Galerie Saint-Étienne, and the present moment. It is an order of magnitude that is literally incomparable.
And it was amazing because you walked in and you could see that this was an obsessive collector. Most collectors are addicts. This one appeared to be an obsessive collector because of the nature and the extent of the collection of Schiele that he had put together.
It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm proud and happy that my collection will be seen in the most famous modern art museum of the world.
It was beautifully done, actually. I remember the lights being very low and had a very large crowd, and there was kind of a buzz, and I was talking with a lot of people, and people were talking about Leopold because he was such an obsessive collector, and because he had done some things that people were naturally gossiping about, including the way he treated a lot of his paintings. He was known for retouching some of Schiele's works, for doing pretty extensive conservation of his own, even though he wasn't a curator. So it was very exciting. And at one point, I was talking with several people. Just one person said to me, oh, and there's, besides all this other stuff going on, there's a Nazi connection as well.
I ran into Judy, and I said to her, I think I might have a story for you about this show. And that was the beginning of events that I think none of us ever in our wildest dreams could have anticipated at that moment. Lea Bondi ran one of the leading galleries for modern art in Vienna. And she showed and bought and sold Schiele's work as a dealer.
She was a remarkable woman. She was understanding, kind, and she was an extremely forceful woman. She had to be.
Vienna was and is a very pleasant place to live. I would think she would have had a very interesting and nice life with a circle of friends and a community, a sense of community. You have to remember there were at least 200,000 Jews in Vienna.
Under Kaiser Franz Joseph, it was quite good to come to Austria. There were 6,000 Jews in 1848, I would say, in Austria. And then up to 1930, there were about 200,000 already, because Jews received from the emperor the same rights as other citizens.
In Vienna, one was always aware of being Jewish and not being one of them.
The Jews in Vienna, no matter how wealthy, were still outside of the establishment. They were, in a sense, mentally free to embrace new movements, new ideas.
You gotta remember, the Vienna of the 20s was like Berlin of the 20s. It was a very open city. Open to modern ideas, modern thought, modern anything. The sexual mores were as loose as they are in New York now. And everything changed overnight. They had an amazing ability to change at almost lightning speed.
Austrian anti-Semitism, I would say, is based on a very Catholic anti-Semitism. For the Catholic population, and Austria is mainly Catholic, Jews were the ones who crucified Jesus.
Jews lost their right to vote, they lost most of their property rights, they had to pay extortionate taxes. If they owned businesses, their businesses were confiscated.
She said it was a bad time, a time of where if you belonged to the right party, you could do whatever you wanted, and never mind whether it was legal or not.
Lea Bondi owned a gallery in Vienna that was quite well known. However, this painting, Portrait of Wally by Egon Schiele, was not part of the contents of that gallery. It was her personal property.
Portrait of Wally was quite an intimate portrait done in the early part of Schiele's relationship with Wally. And he painted at the same time a self-portrait that is a matching pair to it. It's in contrast to some of his more openly erotic work, but nevertheless it's in line with many of his portraits where he's really depicting the person that is in front of him and has got to the essence of them.
The painting belonged to my aunt. It was taken away from her in 1938 after the Anschluss. Everything was confiscated because she was Jewish.
I acquired the painting about 30 years ago. The painting was my private collection, Privatbesitz, and had nothing to do with Werther. It hung in my apartment at 38 Weisgeberlände 3.
Lea Bondi never had children, and I just imagine that for her, like Wally, the painting that was hanging in her apartment was like her child. It was something that she had, discovered Schiele early. She really loved this. It's a beautiful picture of a woman, and it was a beautiful thing to have in her home.
Her gallery was confiscated by a Nazi, Friedrich Welz, member of the party. After Aryanizing the gallery, he went to Lea Bondi's house. He saw the picture of Wally on the wall and said, I want this too.
This was not an abstract statement by an art fancier about how lovely a painting was. This is a statement by somebody who is capable of having these people taken to a concentration camp.
I explained that this was my private property and had nothing to do with Werther. He wouldn't stop. He kept threatening until my husband said to me, give it to him already. We may want to leave as soon as tomorrow.
Their lives were in the balance there. There wasn't any negotiating. And God knows, I know, you couldn't negotiate with Nazis. You were lucky if they didn't shoot you on the spot.
Welz took the painting. Lea Bondi left Vienna for London the next day.
Lea Bondi emigrated to London, where she founded a second gallery called the St. George's Gallery.
After the war, she started efforts to get the paintings back in the gallery, and she, after several years, was crowned with success, except for the paintings that had been in her apartment.
It was one of her sorrows of her life that she lost it. It wasn't to the point of where she was morbid about it. She just wanted it back. And she should have had it back.
Lea Bondi went back to Vienna and went to the restitution court, but not for the portrait of Wally, but for the contents of her gallery. She was successful. However, the Austrian court declared that Mr. Welz had put some renovations into the gallery, and therefore, instead of restitution, she owed him some money. He had been put in prison by the Americans for his activities during the war.
From an Austrian standpoint, very truthfully, it's not surprising. This is what happened all the time, that people were forced in the course of restitution proceedings to reimburse the person who had taken, or Aryanized as it was called, their property.
After the war, I asked Welz about the painting when we were discussing the return of the Gallery Wertler. He told me that the painting was erroneously confiscated with the Rieger collection.
The painting had been erroneously restituted to the National Gallery as part of the property of the Rieger family.
The Riegers were Jews in Vienna, art collectors. They had been rounded up, deported, died in Theresienstadt.
The mix-up should have been spotted immediately, as it was listed in the Rieger collection as a portrait of his wife drawing. And the portrait of Wally is an oil painting.
Mistaking a painting for a drawing is a big mistake.
The idea that the director of the National Gallery of Austria was unable to tell the difference between an oil painting and a work on paper is clearly an absurdity.
We have the labels from the Belvedere Museum, and it actually named it Wally from Krumau. The director knew that Edith was the wife's name. Why would he take in a painting that said Wally on it?
The BDA, which is the institution in Austria that preserves Austrian culture, that's charged with making decisions on whether or not to allow the export of, art out of Austria, knew exactly who Egon Schiele was. Egon Schiele was a very, very important Austrian artist. Wally was one of his favorite models. It was his long-term mistress. Edith Schiele, his wife, was also a very popular Egon Schiele subject. There's many pictures of Edith Schiele. There's many pictures of Wally.
I could not believe that all these knowledgeable, prominent Austrian art historians, museums people, could not figure out what it is that they were looking at.
The Belvedere ultimately had a document when they were looking at the inventory of the Rieger collection and they had the list of the items. There's a handwritten notation next to portrait of his wife. They note next to it on their carbon copy, Wally Neuzil from Vienna.
Das Museum wusste, oder der Museumsdirektor wusste, dass dieses Bild, das sie von Rieger gekauft haben, nicht Rieger gehört hat und dass da etwas nicht ganz in Ordnung ist.
Aber zu unterstellen, die österreichische Galerie hätte Quellen vielleicht verunklärt, um Verkaufsmöglichkeiten zu schaffen, die andernfalls nicht transparent genug wären, weil inkorrekt, ist völlig absurd.
Were they just making an honest mistake? Or were they taking advantage of an opportunity
Es scheint für uns, wenn wir das retrospektiv betrachten, natürlich sehr außergewöhnlich. Wie kann eine Verwechslung stattfinden zwischen einer Zeichnung aus einer berühmten Sammlung, Heinrich Rieger, mit einem auch sehr berühmten Ölporträt der Wally Neuzil? Das erscheint für uns äußerst mysteriös und wir können uns das nicht erklären. Ich habe mich natürlich nicht so sehr im Detail damit beschäftigt wie andere mit diesem Fall. Ich gehe eigentlich nicht von einer Verschwörung aus.
My belief was that the museum wanted to amass a huge art collection, and it was good timing. There was a law that was handily passed recently then that forbid the exportation of Austrian artists, which came in handy. So any art that was there, and if the Jewish people weren't in Austria, they'd have to sell it to the museum.
The U.S. Army interviewed Welz. Welz said he didn't get it from Rieger. Welz said the woman in the picture isn't Egon Schiele's wife. The U.S. Army told this to the BDA. They told it to the Belvedere. The BDA and the Belvedere had the inventory of the Rieger collection. They knew exactly what Rieger had. They were warned multiple times by the U.S. Army. They went and looked at the stuff. They had ample basis to question whether or not Portrait of Wally was ever a part of the Rieger collection.
Vor Jahren habe ich 1953 in London getroffen und sie hat mir also einige Schiele-Blätter verkauft und hat auch erklärt, sie möchte über ein Bild, das einmal in ihrem Besitz gewesen sei, mit mir sprechen.
Mr. Leopold is a very complex person, I would say, and I think that his reputation really depends on who you're asking. He is one of the best and most knowledgeable collectors of Schiele and other paintings. And then you have the other side saying, yes, but he didn't buy in good faith because he had such a knowledge since the 50s when he bought something.
Raubkunst bleibt Raubkunst, auch wenn man versucht, mit juristischen Spitzfindigkeiten die Rückgabe dieser Raubkunst zu verhindern.
He is a tremendous collector who has a fine collection of art that would have left Austria if he wouldn't have had a collector with such an obsession like Leopold.
He spoke very passionately about his Schieles and his personal relationship almost to the artist, as if he kind of grew up with him, that he was more knowledgeable about this art than anybody else in the world.
Leopold, he's a typical collector who will do anything in order to buy or to obtain a work of art that he wants.
Leopold knew quite well who owned looted art. He knew about the problems of not being allowed to export these pieces of art. He got in contact with the owners who had left Austria or had been forced to leave Austria and offered them to buy these pieces of art.
Right after the war, there was such turmoil in the art market throughout Europe that you could get almost anything you wanted if you had the money. He did have the money. So if you had the money, you could almost get anything you wanted, which meant not only legal objects, but also things that were not so legal, whose provenance was a little bit shady.
There are countless stories out there about him playing any dirty trick in the book for decades to get his hands on a desired painting, either because he wanted it under all circumstances or because he tried to get it on the cheap.
She talked very nicely about Dr. Leopold, I must say. She thought that he was on her side, which she was a little mistaken about that.
Lea Bondi went to Leopold knowing he was interested in Schiele. In 1954, said that painting is being displayed at the Austrian National Gallery. Please make sure it doesn't disappear. despite that request, he made sure it disappeared into his ownership.
The question is, what did she say to you and what did you say to her?
Also die Frage ist, was haben Sie bei diesem Treffen zu ihr gesagt und was hat sie zu Ihnen gesagt?
Nachdem wir einen Kauf abgeschlossen haben, den Kauf über die Blätter, wie ich vorhin erwähnt habe, hat sie mir plötzlich gesagt, was ich schon erklärt hatte, gefragt, wo ist das Bildnis Wally? Das habe ich ja schon vorher gesagt.
Well, I already explained this before. After we had struck a deal regarding a couple of sheets, works on paper that is, she asked me, where is the portrait of Wally?
Yeah. And I said, in the Belvedere.
Rudolf Leopold came to her gallery in London sometime in the 50s. She was a specialist in Schiele drawings at that time. She asked him for help. She said, please help me get my painting back from the Austrian National Gallery, and if you do, I will be sure to inform you when I have important Schiele works.
Ich sagte, der Auftrag ist unmöglich. Ich würde hinausgeworfen werden, wenn ich einfach komme und sage, geben Sie mir das Bild heraus.
Well, what you're asking me, and I then said, what you're asking me to do is simply impossible to do, because if I just went to the gallery and asked them to hand me over the picture, they would probably throw me out.
Leopold returns to Vienna and barters a Schiele that he has with the museum for this painting.
He already had the self-portrait of the same date, and so for him it was a case of uniting the pair of pictures.
And the next thing she knew, the painting was being exhibited as part of the Leopold collection.
So here comes in Leopold later on, making exchanges with the Belvedere pertaining to a number of Schiele paintings, and included in one of those exchanges is this very innocent portrait of Wally.
Das Museum musste befürchten, dass dieses Bild zurückgegeben werden muss. Dadurch, dass das Museum es weiterverkauft hat, und zwar eingetauscht gegen andere Kunstwerke, wurde das weiß gewaschen.
So when I read this whole file, it just struck me as very odd how things, worked out as far as Wally is concerned, and of course the role that Leopold played from an early stage.
Leopold argumentierte, dass wenn ein Pilzesammler, Collector of Mushrooms, auch einen giftigen Pilz sammelt, der nicht essbar ist, dass der dann trotzdem kein Giftpilzesammler ist.
Hier im Jahr 12 hat er sich völlig ebenbürtig gefühlt und hat es nur mehr so, man sieht es aufs Erste kaum so angedeutet. Bitte beobachten Sie die Hände, er hat ja, also er hat ja niemand so zeichnen können auf neue Weise, nicht?
And Leopold is certainly someone who likes to characterize himself as the discoverer of Schiele, as the person who made Schiele into what he was. And in so doing, he just completely blots out the history, the legacy, and ultimately the names of his pre-war collectors.
The show gets a lot of attention at first. And then On Christmas Eve, a story runs in the New York Times saying that this picture may have some provenance problems, portrait of Wally.
I was talking with my mother about this. I said, well, when did Dad first become aware that the painting was in New York? And she told me that they had gone to see the exhibition at MoMA together, and he saw the picture there and got very upset and said, that's Lishy's painting. They called her Aunt Lishy. That's Lishy's painting.
I got a call from my cousin Henry, who is Andre's father. And he said, did you know that Lishy's painting is at MoMA? Do you think I ought to write them a letter? And I said, of course you do. And my famous answer was, what can happen?
By the time the Wally case came along in 1997, I had established a certain reputation in that field. Pretty much was still the only one, or one of the few ones at that time who dealt with this. So when Henry Bondi called me, I listened to his story, but all Henry Bondi had was a New York Times newspaper article and his personal recollection from the days he knew his aunt.
Henry Bondi wrote a letter to the Museum of Modern Art asking them to help, and the letter they got back was that by contract they were obliged to return the painting to Austria.
When I first saw the story about the Leopold Schiele at MoMA, I assumed that would be, it would take some time. These things do often take time. And that because it was New York, and because the New York State, because New York State has about the toughest law there is, that it would ultimately be restored to the family with the cooperation of MoMA.
They want it back because it belongs to the family, because it belonged to Lea Bondi, because it was her personal property, and it was stolen from her by an avowed Nazi, and then taken from the museum by the very person who professed to help her get it back. It's injustice upon injustice upon injustice.
This is about seeing that the facts, as disturbing as they may be, are not hidden, are not shredded, are not placed in vaults and secrecy clamped over them, but that the facts be unearthed.
We quickly thought that this was something that D'Amato should support.
Am 6. Jänner fordert der amerikanische Senator Alphonse D'Amato die Beschlagnahme der gesamten Ausstellung.
And yes, indeed, the letter was not only drafted, but either signed in his name or signed by him and sent out, expressing his support for the ongoing efforts, pertaining to this painting. But shortly after it was publicized, the letter was withdrawn.
This was big. This was a big painting. This involved another government. This was at a major New York museum. Private people with private concerns who had a lot of influence in the art world did not want the federal government to be involved.
D'Amato then heard from Ronald Lauder, who was a major Republican donor, and he contacted Customs and said, please disregard the facts that I sent over earlier today.
Late yesterday, the Manhattan District Attorney issued a subpoena that could keep the works in the U.S. until his investigation into their ownership is completed.
Am 7. Jänner ordnet die New Yorker Staatsanwaltschaft die Beschlagnahme der Bilder Tote Stadt 3 und Porträt der Wally an.
It was due to go back within a couple of days to Austria. There seemed to be enough basis for going to the grand jury, so we served a grand jury subpoena. Kind of routine, ain't nothing special. I must say I didn't fully appreciate the outcry that would cause, but would have done it anyway.
Am 8. Jänner tritt in Wien ein Krisenstab zusammen. Der kaufmännische Direktor der Stiftung Leopold, Klaus Schröder, Rudolf Leopold selbst und Unterrichtsministerin Elisabeth Gera.
Dass die einen Anlassfall für die Verschärfung des Gesetzes suchen und andererseits mit der Geldgier. Jetzt ist Schiele, hat Schiele einen weit, weit höheren Preis als damals. Nicht? Und wenn betont wird, sowohl von Frau Reif als auch von Henry Bondi, dass es nur ums Recht und nicht um das Geld geht, dann kann man eigentlich nur bitter lachen.
Immediately, the Museum of Modern Art and the Austrian government and the Leopold Foundation and all the newspapers in New York and all the other museums in New York say publicly that they're scandalized and appalled by what Robert Morgenthau has done.
According to a statement from the DA's office, Morgenthau has opened an investigation to determine if the paintings were stolen.
I think it's the Wall Street Journal that was most critical of the action. It said he must have lost his mind.
Glenn Lowry, MoMA's director, fears that the district attorney's action will hurt museums' abilities to borrow paintings in the future.
I spoke with Glenn Lowry several times. He gave me the museum's official position. He said that this would be very damaging to museums. They wouldn't be able to borrow paintings. There was no way that MoMA could get in the middle of a situation like this.
They didn't start the problem. They didn't do anything. They have it, and that's that. So of course you support them. Why would you condemn them? What were they supposed to do? Give it back to the wrong heirs?
The district attorney's action in barring the paintings from returning to the lender has the potential of seriously affecting the future of art loans in this country. Unless we can assure lenders that American art museums will return borrowed works of art, lenders, fearing seizure, will simply not lend. That would be a disaster for the American public, which has come to expect first-class exhibitions at art institutions across this great land.
Then the entire museum community fell in line behind this perspective of don't mess with internal museum affairs, you government and other kinds of bureaucrats, because you don't understand.
I thought the argument was an absolute jaw-dropper, I really did. What they were in essence saying was that they had an interest in closing their eyes to what might otherwise have been obvious in the interest of displaying paintings to the public.
Let's not forget that the entire New York museums community, including the Jewish Museum, got together in order to express its deep concerns about this and how art lending as known to mankind would come to an end.
And everybody said, well, this is a terrible thing. Nobody will send their art to New York for exhibit if this case is successful. You don't want stolen art on loan, so it might keep stolen art from coming in.
We at the Met were very concerned, as was everybody else, and the press was incredibly interested in pursuing it as much as possible, especially if they could catch a museum like the MoMA or the Met doing something bad, or allegedly bad.
Now the Museum of Modern Art has filed a motion to quash that subpoena, which the Met and several other New York museums have supported in writing. Glenn Lowry is director of the Museum of Modern Art.
My hope is that reason will prevail, that once the situation with the district attorney is resolved, we will be able to fulfill our obligation to our lenders.
In the case of the paintings the two paintings that were seized, they should have gone back to Austria, and the Austrians agreed to a fair and open discussion about these two pictures.
Well, to my knowledge, when the paintings were seized in 1997, all the restitution laws of the 50s were over already.
So forcing someone to enter the legal system in Austria was basically like giving the painting back.
I think that there's a day of reckoning that many museums have to face. They have squandered public resources. They have taken money that they received subject to a tax exemption. They used it to buy stolen property that they never owned and that they've had to give up. And in the case of the Getty and other museums, they've given up millions and millions of dollars worth of property. And there's been no accounting. I would put the Museum of Modern Art in that category. I think they've wasted resources fighting this Portrait of Wally case. Rather than use those resources, a tiny fraction of those resources could have maybe worked out a settlement.
They were thinking much more as an institution. And there is something about curators. Once an object comes into a museum, it should have a hard way finding its way out. And this is a law, almost an unwritten law, that is respected by all curators, consciously or unconsciously. And usually, I believe this is what MoMA is working on.
You must remember also that museum directors are themselves really the butlers for the board. And a good butler does not defy the wishes, even if he doesn't know the wishes, what he presumes to be the wishes of his masters.
Mr. Lauder had a whole series of conflicts of interest. I mean, the whole case was extraordinary.
He had many loyalties, and they were definitely in conflict. He was chairman of the museum and wanted the museum to be able to borrow paintings on a regular basis without running into these problems again. He was, if not a friend, certainly a colleague of Dr. Leopold, because they were both big collectors of Schiele.
The Schiele exhibition had been brought into MoMA with enormous support from the chairman of their board, who was Ron Lauder, who, as I understand it, put up $500,000 of his own dollars to help bring this in, to facilitate it. He himself, who is a collector in general of Austrian art, in particular of Schiele, whose ambassadorship to Austria had a cloud over it because he had been pulling out of Austria works that the Austrians deemed part of their patrimony under the legitimacy of diplomatic pouch, and yet who had founded an entity called the Commission on Art Recovery, at the founding of which he announced very brashly that we are going to tear paintings off museum walls. It wasn't, we're going to research, it wasn't, we're going to help facilitate fair, it was, we're going to take paintings off museum walls.
What I can say is that our commission, which is being put together as we speak, will be working very closely with museums, with the Art Dealers Association, with the various other organizations to try and come up both with a database of what we need to be done, as well as certain ideas of how we can accomplish releasing of what we call the last prisoners of war.
What amazed me was that Mr. Lauder, who had been involved in restitution of property, took such a cavalier attitude regarding this particular picture. I couldn't understand it. I still don't understand it. I would love to ask him.
I thought, he could have sort of settled this out of petty cash.
But I think Lauder has acquitted himself very well in this area. I think he really has. And setting up, the greatest possible thing you could do, he did, which is to set up a museum for German and Austrian art in New York and do it on such a brilliant scale that he's made the field.
Where would Ronald Lauder stand if Mr. Lauder would agree to an interview, but a really probing one, in which he actually honestly answered the questions, what he might say about the question of Portrait of Wally and who it really belongs to? When you take the MoMA equation out of the story, I don't think he's a villain in this. I don't think there really are any villains. There may be a few in Austria. But it's one of those stories in which you really wish that the people who have the high ground, like the Museum of Modern Art, would stand themselves on the high ground.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Robert Siegel.
And I'm Melissa Block. New York's Museum of Modern Art reopened this fall in an expanded, renovated building that still shows only a fraction of its famed permanent collection. Among the pieces not on display is a painting that's allegedly stolen.
My editors at National Public Radio wanted me to follow up on this case. They thought it was a great story.
David Darcy reports.
The chairman of the Museum of Modern Art is Estee Lauder Cosmetics heir Ronald Lauder. He's a major collector of the Viennese artists Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele. Lauder's also the founder of the Commission for Art Recovery, which has urged museums around the world to search their collections for art looted from Jewish families in the Nazi era. Museums like MoMA.
I think it's a very important moment because these paintings and paintings throughout museums and private collections that were looted from Jewish homes are perhaps the last prisoners of World War II.
But regarding a specific painting, Egon Schiele's portrait of Wally, his museum's official position is different. MoMA opposes a Jewish family's effort to recover the painting.
In our mailbag this week, a complaint about our story from reporter David Darcy on a dispute over the painting Portrait of Wally.
In a story on All Things Considered on December 27th, we reported on the controversy over ownership of a painting on loan to the Museum of Modern Art. However, we did not report the museum's statement made to NPR that it had never taken a position on the question of the painting's ownership.
The museum had taken a position on this matter, and I thought it was shoddy of NPR to allow the museum. It wasn't shoddy to allow them to have a correction, but since the correction wasn't accurate, it was shoddy for them to allow the museum to pressure them into having an inaccurate correction. Corrections are supposed to be accurate, and they didn't issue a correction of the correction, and that's simply bad management.
For MoMA to get upset because they were accused of taking a position in the case is absurd. That's what they had done from the very beginning.
For them to have said that David omitted their side of the story or didn't give them an opportunity is a really outrageous statement, and for NPR to have printed a correction affirming that is ludicrous. David had a fax from MoMA's Public Relations Office in which they declined to speak with him.
In view of the fact that you have prepared a report which we judge not to be fair and balanced, our contract with you is terminated for 6 months, after which you can reapply to be affiliated with National Public Radio.
I find it appalling, if it's true, and I suspect it is, that with something as simple as a phone call to NPR, the life and future of a seasoned, reliable, honest reporter can be so badly affected, as you have in many big cultural organizations. People on the board of MoMA, and I'm not talking about Ronald Lauder in particular, but a whole bunch of people, have never heard the word no. They will not accept anything but Yazza boss from everyone who works for them, and even people on the outside who want access to their museum. I think NPR should be ashamed of itself.
Initially, what we found most positive for our investigation, most helpful, was the letters that Lea Bondi wrote to Otto Kallir, and he was the dealer in New York who had fled Austria.
He worked at the Würzler Gallery. Mrs. Bondi was the director, and Otto Kallir, who was younger than she, started working there in around 1920. He then founded his gallery in 1923, and they became friendly competitors.
My grandfather had a file of correspondence with Lea that documented the theft of portrait of Wally. Certainly, I would do everything to get my Schiele back. I don't know if it is possible. I have the feeling that everybody in Vienna is for Leopold and nobody wanted to touch him.
I can hear her, and you can see in the handwriting the excitement, the nervousness about it, the sadness, the upset that was in those recollections.
To put it in the vernacular, she was pissed. First of all, she liked the painting. It was hers, it belonged to her, and she bought it when Schiele was not well known. It was her property, and she was angry that it was stolen out of her home. And she did everything she could under difficult circumstances. Remember, her financial circumstances were not good at that time.
The value to her was enormous, but to spend an enormous amount of money that she didn't have to get the picture back was so difficult because it had no market value. In the 50s, we sold watercolors for $250. This oil painting would barely be worth $1,000.
Dr. Huna was her lawyer, wants me to bring suit, but absolutely everybody, also in Vienna, advises against it because all suits from emigrated Jews in Vienna are lost.
And the lawyers said, well, yes, we will try, but there is such strong opposition, both from the authorities and also from the influence of Rudolf Leopold, that it's almost hopeless.
He is the one for Schieles to decide whether or not to allow Schieles to leave Austria. The BDA goes to Professor Leopold. He is the decider.
Don't forget all the people who were wearing uniforms before the war now are wearing business suits.
The Austrians lived very comfortably with the point of view that they developed after the war, that they were the first victim of Nazi aggression, and conveniently forgot how many people assembled in Vienna when Hitler came into town, and how many people voted for the Anschluss.
Hitler was welcomed with much more than open arms. I mean, Vienna was en fête when he came.
I can tell you one joke which is also very usual in schools, that the joke goes that way. An Austrian pupil says to another, or to his teacher, my grandpa died in a concentration camp, and they start becoming very calm and quiet and say, oh, really, he died in a concentration camp? And then he says, yes, he fell drunken from the watchtower. So I think in the first reaction, one would say it's a very cynical joke, but it's also, I think, a very smart joke in the reality of Austria 50, 60 years afterwards, because everybody is against Nazis in generally, and everybody has the impression there are a lot of victims, but there are no perpetrators. It's a fact that more Austrian young people has grandpas who were perpetrators than they have grandpas who were victims.
Austria are very good in just denying the problems, because our welfare is quite grounded on cruelty that has been given to other people. It's really a history we still keep our mouths shut, and Austria is very good in keeping mouths shut. We have our Mozart, we are very high educated, we're very nice, everyone loves us. We don't have this honesty just to admit how our welfare was created, so we don't have the right to be in a good mood. So I really hated on that position to be Austrian.
It's part of Austrian history. You have people after the war completely rewriting the Nazi era and questioning who were the real victims of Nazism, who were the perpetrators, who were the victims. You kind of have these bizarre conflations where people try retrospectively to absolve themselves of terrible, terrible crimes.
There was a kid who was in the Hitler Youth who was a Jew, but he had 4 Aryan grandparents. I don't know how the hell that worked, but it did. So you get these insane diversions.
These are the people that Lea Bondi had to ask assistance from, even the attorneys in law firms. I mean, basically, the whole Jewish population was wiped out.
My mother called me and said, if you want to see Lishi, you better come. She's failing. And I went to visit her, and turned out to be 2 weeks before her death.
The deathbed letter was an important piece of evidence for us because it told the story in Lea's own words about exactly what happened to her. Unfortunately, she died in 1969.
She never, until she died, she was asking Otto Kallir for his help. It was our opinion, and for the government, that she never gave up.
At some point, we asked the federal authorities to put a detainer on the portrait, so in case our case was dismissed, it would still be held by U.S. Customs.
We weren't sure that they were going to be able to hold that painting, and we wanted to make sure that we could get it. I had all my evidence, we had all our ducks in order. We knew that we had enough for a seizure warrant.
The key issue was a state statute, which said that when a work of art came in, it was not subject to being seized in the jurisdiction, but we were convinced that that applied only in civil cases.
Finally, the Court of Appeals decided that the law says no seizure, no attachment of any kind by a judge, and that therefore includes even an attachment that's instigated by criminal authorities like the district attorney's office.
The day that Morgenthau's state case was dismissed, we went into federal court, we marched into federal court with a prepared affidavit, and we obtained a seizure warrant for the painting.
In New York City, the United States Attorney has seized one of 2 disputed paintings by turn-of-the-century Austrian artist Egon Schiele. The Manhattan District Attorney had held the 2 paintings under subpoena for the last 20 months. Earlier this week, a state court overruled the subpoena, and it appeared that both pictures were headed back to Austria.
And I think Dead City returned to Austria within hours or a day of the Court of Appeals
The very
decision.
thing we were
Right.
worried about happening with our client.
We looked at both of them, and we just decided that we didn't have a basis to go forward and get a seizure warrant for Dead City.
The Museum of Modern Art and the Leopold Museum made motions to dismiss, and indeed was supported by Friends of the Court brief, an amicus brief, submitted by the American Association of Museum Directors and the American Association of Museums, as well as about 9 museums, I think.
The Museum of Modern Art left its allegedly neutral position. We have nothing to do with this. We are just having this painting on loan, we have to return it, we have a contract. Switched from this allegedly neutral position into taking the point of view of the Leopold Foundation.
They were the first ones to make the argument that the recovery doctrine, that the U.S. armed forces in Austria were acting as agents for the Holocaust victims, and therefore, when the U.S. armed forces recovered stolen Holocaust property, that it was no longer stolen anymore.
I decided that because the painting initially had been recovered by American troops after the war, that kind of broke the chain.
Now, the Americans, it was not their job to sort it out, but it was their job to scoop it up and give it back to the Austrians so that the Austrians could sort it out.
We moved for reconsideration. We re-argued the case, and Judge Mukasey reversed his decision.
The additional facts showed that U.S. troops were not really in the position of the same position that law enforcement is in when they recover stolen goods. They were simply there to organize property and turn it over to a government without regard to whether it was going to be given back to the proper heirs or not.
The issue has been legalities, not moralities. His decision to allow it to go forward is kind of based on a technicality that the U.S. government, that the U.S. Army after the war could not be construed to have been an agent of recovery for the family of this painting and so on. That's aside from what will now finally be discussed, which is who really should own it now.
It's going to be sold, so you split up the cash however you can. Half to Bondi, half to Leopold, something like that. That's the way it'll end up. It's not a moral matter, it's a money matter. Because the moral issues in these areas get shady pretty fast, especially when there's a chance to get money out of it.
Ich wollte ja wissen, Sie haben sich ja bestens oder kennen sich bestens aus mit Schiele. Also Sie haben gewusst, Frau Bondi-Jahre hat bis 1938 das Bild gehabt und plötzlich sehen Sie hier in der Österreichischen Galerie Sammlung Rieger und da erscheint unter Frauenbildnis, was ja auch schon ein bisschen eigenartig ist. Nicht, wenn das Bildporträt Wally heißt, warum heißt es jetzt plötzlich Frauenbildnis? Ist das nicht so eine bisschen gezielte Schlamperei auch gewesen? Haben Sie sich da nicht irgendwie gedacht, wieso?
Nein, ich konnte mir das deswegen nicht denken, weil ich ja jetzt zum ersten Mal diese Akten nämlich gesehen habe, dass es hier unter Frauenbildnis lag.
Sie haben aber gewusst, das ist die Wally.
Ja, mir wurde immer gesagt, dass die Österreichische Galerie von Dr. Hubert Rieger diese drei Bilder erworben hätte, ja nicht nur.
Notwithstanding all of that, in his 1972 book that he spent 5 years researching and writing, he says explicitly that Rieger only owned 2 Schiele oil paintings, Cardinal and Nun and Embrace, not Portrait of Wally. It is clear that his knowledge at that time was that Heinrich Rieger nor the Rieger estate ever owned Portrait of Wally. Now you look at the 1997 provenance. Leopold wrote the provenance for Portrait of Wally, and he included in that Emil Topher, Richard Lanier, Lea Bondi. Then he put down Heinrich Rieger, Vienna, Rieger Jr., London, and then Belvedere Gallery, and then himself. He set up this false provenance to hide the fact that there was this, gap in the ownership of Portrait of Wally.
I asked him that. He said, well, for him, it wasn't important. It was only important that it's not a fake. Yeah? So for him, doesn't matter. It's okay, it's a Schiele. And now I'm now the owner. Or when he was looking for a new painting, he's of course interesting to know who is the owner before or where he can contact. That's all.
Ultimately, it was agreed that the government would go to Vienna to take the depositions of Rudolf and Elizabeth Leopold, with the one caveat that Rudolf Leopold was narcoleptic, so that we couldn't take the deposition during the regular daytime hours. We had to start the deposition at 2 o'clock.
He did not write a book about this specific artwork.
And go from 2 o'clock until, I believe, 10 p.m.
Go ahead, please. Und auf einmal sagte Frau Jahre zu mir, fragte mich Frau Jahre, wissen Sie, wo mein Bildnis von Wally ist?
And suddenly Mrs. Yarai asked me, do you know where my portrait of Wally is?
Ich antwortete, es ist Eigentum der österreichischen Galerie.
And I replied, it is the property of the Austrian gallery.
It seemed clear to us that, at least on a moral level, Lea Bondi was still the owner of Portrait of Wally. But that doesn't mean legally it's her property. The issue in these type of cases is, does the person who made the importation know that it was stolen property?
Sie sagte daraufhin, naja, es gehört aber mir, gehen Sie bitte für mich zur Galerie und holen Sie das Bild und geben Sie es dann entweder durch eine Spedition an mich auf.
And she responded, but it is mine. Please go to the gallery, get the painting, and then ship it to me.
There was an assertion of ownership by Lea Bondi. I mean, you can't very well say that I've acquired this painting with absolutely no knowledge that anybody else makes a claim to it, other than this one little claim by this one little woman. But apart from that, well, once you say that, you are, forgive the analogy, a little bit pregnant.
Judge Mukasey, meanwhile, became Attorney General of the United States, and therefore we had a new judge in the case, Loretta Preska.
Ultimately, Judge Preska ruled in the government's favor on every single issue in the case. She found that Lea Bondi Jure always remained the owner of Portrait of Wally. The Belvedere Gallery didn't get good title to Portrait of Wally. Rudolf Leopold didn't get good title to Portrait of Wally. And the Leopold Museum did not get good title to Portrait of Wally. Judge Preska definitively ruled when a Nazi takes property from you, it's a theft. So in the end, the real issue at the heart of the case was, did Professor Leopold, did he know in 1997 when he brought it in that Portrait of Wally was stolen property? And she was going to allow a trial on this single issue. She was going to allow the Leopold Museum to present evidence that Professor Leopold in 1997 didn't know Wally was stolen when it was brought into the United States. And that's what we were set to go to trial on July 26th.
Der Kunstsammler Rudolf Leopold ist tot. Der Schiele- und Klimt-Kenner ist heute nur wenige Monate nach seinem 85. Geburtstag verstorben.
Er hatte den Beinbruch, darauf folgend eine schwere Grippeerkrankung. Das Ganze hat sich aufs Herz geschlagen und leider konnte man ihm nicht mehr helfen. Er ist heute um 14 Uhr verstorben. Er war ein großartiger Sammler, ein großartiger Mensch. Von meiner Seite aus tut es uns natürlich wahnsinnig leid, dass wir ihn verloren haben. Das Tollste und Schönste ist natürlich, dass es dieses Museum gibt, und es ist auch ein Andenken an ihn und soll auch ein Andenken in der Zukunft bleiben.
As we know, he was director for life in his own museum, even though it was basically run and particularly financed by the government. Everybody, I thought, wanted to avoid any kind of confrontation with Leopold. I mean, the guy had a short fuse.
Also 10 trees in Herzl Forest in memory of... Was heißt, ich darf nicht sagen, was... Sie haben gefragt, you have asked me, what I see here. And you say objection if I read this.
Go ahead, Dr. Leopold, you're doing fine.
Das ist ja unerhört, sowas. Sie fragen und ich antworte.
It was my clear impression from the beginning, because of who Leopold was and because of his lifelong remaining role, that nobody wanted to pick a fight with him or get in a situation where there would be any kind of confrontation. In that sense, I think it is not surprising that this case was resolved around the time when Leopold died.
Also er hat während seiner Lebzeit die Weichen gestellt, um es zu bekommen. Und er hatte auch schon die Zusage der anderen Seite. Er weiß davon, er wusste davon, dass der Vergleich zustande kommen wird. Aber es war sein Betreiben, es war sein Wunsch.
The Leopold Museum had contacted the estate and essentially was offering to buy Portrait of Wally from them. Wally had been appraised, actually sort of at the higher point in the market, of between $15 to $20 million, and they were offering to pay $19 million for Portrait of Wally.
Es war sagen, nichts mit kleinen Summen. Wir geben ihnen alles und wir haben ein Ende.
First of all, the attorneys got a good portion of it, I think between 5 and 6 million. But on the other hand, they took it on a contingency. They could easily have lost. There are approximately 50 people, approximately. Nobody's going to get rich on this.
This receipt is just saying that one oil painting signed by Egon Schiele, Portrait of Wally, was released by the United States Department of Immigration and Customs Enforcement to the Leopold Museum, the foundation. And I'm just going to fill in where and the time and what time. And then I'm going to sign this, and I believe Mrs. Leopold is going to sign this.
I don't think about money. I only think about art. And I think to my husband, he died 4 weeks ago, and it was his wish, and es war sein Wille und sein Betreiben. Denn die Foundation hätte nie so viel Geld gegeben, wenn nicht Leopold gesagt hätte, wir wollen zu einem Ende kommen. Und so erfüllen wir jetzt den Wunsch von Rudolf Leopold, die Sache in dieser Weise zu beenden. Die andere Seite könnte meiner Ansicht nach ganz zufrieden sein, und wir haben das Bild.
The Leopold Museum transferred $19 million into the asset forfeiture suspense account held by the Department of Treasury. They would be allowed to go and pick up Portrait of Wally, but they were required under the terms of the settlement agreement to enter into a loan agreement with the Museum of Jewish Heritage in Lower Manhattan for an exhibition of Portrait of Wally and a ceremony there.
When I brought my father a copy of Agent Goldblatt's federal seizure warrant, he was seated in a wheelchair in his driveway. And he just beamed and shook his head in wonder and disbelief that this was happening, that justice was finally being done. For me, that moving moment exemplifies what this restitution effort is all about. And I warmly thank all of those who helped to make it possible. Thank you.
It's a testament to the nature and the resolve of Bob Oglethorpe. You know, he has just has his reputation as being a bulldog, and believe me, it is well deserved.
Well, all's well that ends well, but it certainly was not clear 13 years ago that we would have this successful conclusion. And I want to thank and congratulate the United States Attorney, the Homeland Security people. I want to thank all of them for the hard work and capable professional work that brought this matter to a successful conclusion. And I want to thank the Leopold Museum for agreeing to a very significant settlement. Someone asked me, first time I saw the painting, and I said, you know, I saw the photo, I've seen it before, but never had. You're satisfied with the settlement, I think?
It's a very good outcome, I think. Very good outcome.
I can't say it's a happy ending, but at least I can say that it's what the family was able to accomplish, and that's what's the most important. But it's really sad that it took this long to resolve really what started as a very simple story, but was made extraordinarily complicated by the Museum of Modern Art and all those who supported it. So, and it's ironic to see all the parties here because it's a very odd type of love fest. Because all of a sudden everyone's here to celebrate this. But 12 years ago, they were firing shotguns at the family, saying that they were arrogant, they were greedy. All they could think about was the money associated with the painting, and you could still hear this. But I think now the tune has changed.
It will be here in this museum for 3 weeks, and I find it's a very good idea to bring it in this museum, in this institution. I take it as a token for reconciliation and respect and mutual tolerance, and hopeful the beginning of a lasting cooperation.
The government did not think it was appropriate for Elizabeth Leopold to speak at this ceremony. This was more about the victims and how they were finally going to be obtaining justice in terms of compensation for Portrait of Wally and recognition that they were the true owners.
And the Jewish intelligentsia contributed in so many ways to the generation of what we call the Wiener Moderne, that means the art of Vienna.
I happened to be standing next to Lea Bondi when she gave her speech, and I don't think that he was happy to hear it.
I just remind you of few names: Sigmund Freud, Gustav Mahler, Arnold Schönberg, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Arthur Schnitzler, Karl Kraus, Hugo von Offenbach.
She talked about tolerance. I said to myself, thank you very much. I don't want to be tolerated. I just want to live a normal life and be respected as an individual. This is not about tolerance. Tolerance has an aura of condescension in it.
I hope that Portrait of Wally will be a symbol for tolerance, respect, and cooperation. I thank you.
care of his luggage. I wish you a very pleasant remaining day. Goodbye und auf Wiedersehen.
Wally ist wieder in Wien. Aus New York kommend ist heute früh Egon Schieles mittlerweile wohl bekanntestes Gemälde, das Bildnis Wally, in Wien eingetroffen. Das lang umkämpfte Bild kehrt nach einer außergerichtlichen Einigung nach Österreich zurück. Die Stiftung Leopold hat 15 Millionen Euro an die Erben der ursprünglichen Besitzerin gezahlt.
It was Wally that created this shock in Austria that forced the Austrians to respond. I think it's obviously most ironic in the end that out of all the paintings that were claimed after Wally in Austria, which all of them left Austria, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art, it is this painting that comes back to Austria, that this painting for the first time the Austrians come up with a substantial amount of money to bring this painting back. I don't know whether the Leopold Foundation and the Leopold family really deserve it in the end. I have my doubts about that.
Aber jetzt kann man es sehen, dass es besser ausschaut wie die Vogel, die wir im Museum gehabt haben. Museum of Modern Art. Sie werden dann sehen, wenn ich das rote Tuch entferne, wie sehr diese beiden Bilder aufeinander zugehen. Schiele neigt sich nach rechts, Wally nach links, und es ist eigentlich keine Frau in Schieles Leben so eindeutig als zu ihm gehörig dargestellt worden.
I'm sorry the picture went back. But I suppose it does belong next to his self-portrait. But I'm still sorry it went back. Money is really very much secondary. We never expected to get any monetary advantage out of this. And in spite of what Mrs. Leopold said, that this was just greed, it wasn't. It was principle.
It is only half. The value for himself alone is only, or herself alone is only half. It must be the other, he must be the man, Egon, on her side. And they were together many years, and she was a very good helper and lover for him. And I think that this idea of him to make two portraits and the Egon go to right and the Wally go to left, this is neigen zueinander, the going together is a very nice thank you for all what she has done for him.
think to the United States, the most important thing was we wanted a sign placed next to Portrait of Wally so that everyone would know exactly what happened to Portrait of Wally, that it always belonged to Lea Bondi. She never lost title to Portrait of Wally, and the steps that she and her family had to take to get it back, that there was a U.S. government action. Essentially, we tried to tell the story of how her estate finally, got its ownership rights back.
This is about righting a wrong. This is about drawing attention to a wrong. This is about a historical truth, which had been swept under the rug. This was not about money. This was not about money. This was about, as my father put it at the time, establishing acknowledgement of ownership of the painting.
My cousin Edith Southwell and I were talking the other day on the phone, said, what do you think Lishi would, what is Lishi doing if she could see this? And we both said she'd sit there and laugh and laugh and laugh. She would have been pleased and surprised. But she probably would say it's about time.